For years, the silence surrounding Keanu Reeves had been louder than any headline. It was not the kind of absence that could be explained by a break from acting or a quiet retreat from fame. This silence felt deeper, heavier, like a door that had closed without explanation and refused to open again. Sandra Bullock had learned to live with it, or at least she had told herself she had. Life, after all, had demanded that she move forward. Projects continued, days passed. Laughter returned when it had to, and yet there was always a quiet corner of her mind that never stopped wondering what had happened to the man who once stood beside her not just on screen, but in moments that never belonged to cameras. Their friendship had never been loud. It was built on shared understanding, gentle humor, and an unspoken respect that did not need validation from the outside world. When Keanu slowly disappeared from her life, there had been no dramatic argument, no final phone call, no explanation she could hold on to. Messages went unanswered. Calls rang until voicemail claimed them. At first, Sandra assumed it was simply time, distance, or life doing what it always does to people who grow busier. But weeks became months, and months stretched into years. The absence stopped feeling temporary and began to feel permanent. Sandra rarely spoke about it. Publicly, she smiled, worked, inspired, and moved with the grace people expected of her. Privately, there were moments when a familiar memory would surface unexpectedly, catching her off guard. A certain laugh in a crowded room, a quiet kindness she witnessed in a stranger, a late-night conversation replaying in her thoughts for no clear reason. She never allowed herself to romanticize the silence, but she also never allowed herself to forget it. The years passed quietly, until one ordinary afternoon changed everything. Sandra had never planned to be at the hospital that day. She wasn't sick, and she wasn't visiting anyone she knew. The visit was tied to a charity initiative she had supported for years, one that focused on improving patient care and mental health support in long-term treatment facilities. She believed deeply in the idea that healing was not only physical, but emotional, and that dignity mattered just as much as medicine. It was the kind of work she preferred, far from flashing cameras and red carpets. The hospital was older than most, its hallways carrying the faint echoes of decades of lives passing through. The air smelled of antiseptic and something softer beneath it, something human. Nurses moved with practiced urgency, doctors spoke in low tones, and patients waited quietly, each carrying stories that no one else could fully see. Sandra walked slowly, listening more than she spoke, observing details that reminded her why this work mattered. At one point, she was guided toward a small administrative office where old records were kept. The hospital director explained that many of the patients they supported had no families checking in on them, no visitors, no one asking questions. The logbooks were often the only proof that someone had been there, that they existed, that they mattered. Sandra nodded, absorbing the weight of that reality. As part of the visit, she was shown the old admission records, handwritten entries stacked carefully on shelves. Names filled page after page, each one representing a life that had intersected briefly with those walls. Sandra didn't know why she reached for one particular book. There was no reason, no intuition she could explain, no voice guiding her hand. She simply pulled it free and opened it, her fingers brushing against the yellowed pages. She wasn't looking for anything specific. Then she saw the name. At first, she told herself it had to be coincidence. A name could belong to anyone. Thousands of people shared the same letters, the same arrangement of syllables. Her breath slowed, her eyes tracing the ink carefully, as if reading too quickly might break the fragile reality forming in front of her. The handwriting was neat but tired, written by someone who had probably filled in hundreds of names before and after this one. Keanu Reeves. The world around her seemed to pause. Sandra's heart began to beat louder in her ears, a steady rhythm that drowned out the hum of the hospital. She read the entry again, slower this time, noting the date beside it. It was from years ago, around the time he had vanished from her life. Beneath the name were clinical notes she didn't fully understand, references to long-term care, trauma recovery, and psychological observation. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned the page, afraid of what she might find and equally afraid of what she might not. The director noticed the change in her expression and gently asked if everything was all right. Sandra didn't answer immediately. She was still staring at the page, trying to reconcile the man she knew with the words written in ink. The Keanu she remembered was thoughtful, quietly strong, deeply empathetic. The idea that he had been here alone, unseen, while the world assumed he was simply choosing privacy, struck her with unexpected force. She finally looked up, her voice calm but strained. She asked if the hospital still had any records connected to that name. The director hesitated, explaining that patient confidentiality was strictly protected, but acknowledged that older cases sometimes allowed limited inquiries, especially if there was reason to believe the person had no current support system. Sandra nodded, understanding the boundaries, but something inside her refused to let the moment pass. This was not curiosity. This was not nostalgia. It was the unmistakable pull of unfinished concern. As they continued walking, her mind raced. Questions formed faster than she could organize them. Why hadn't he reached out? Had he wanted to disappear, or had he believed no one would come looking? Had she missed signs, moments where she could have noticed something was wrong but did? The idea unsettled her deeply. For the rest of the visit, Sandra remained present, listening to patients, thanking staff, offering words of encouragement where they were needed. But beneath her composed exterior, a quiet storm was building. The hospital logbook had reopened a chapter of her life she had never truly closed, only sealed away for survival. That evening, alone in her car, Sandra sat quietly before turning the key in the ignition. The city lights reflected softly on the windshield, and for a moment she allowed herself to feel everything she had pushed aside for years. Confusion, concern, guilt, and beneath it all, a profound sense of responsibility. If Keanu Reeves had been gone all those years not by choice, but by circumstance, then the silence between them had never been abandonment. It had been something far more complicated, something shaped by pain, isolation, and perhaps the belief that disappearing was the only way to protect others. Sandra took a deep breath, steadying herself. She didn't yet know where this discovery would lead, or what she would find if she followed it. She only knew one thing with certainty. If there was even a chance that the man she once cared deeply for had faced his darkest moments alone, then she could not turn away now. Sometimes resilience begins not with strength, but with the courage to look back at what was lost and choose to search for it anyway. And that night, Sandra Bullock made a quiet decision that would change both their lives forever. The years no one saw, and the silence that nearly broke him. The night Sandra Bullock left the hospital, she did not sleep. Her mind refused rest, replaying the image of that name written in ink, trapped inside a logbook that had quietly held more truth than any headline ever could. She lay awake listening to the distant hum of the city, the weight of unanswered questions pressing against her chest. For years, she had learned to accept uncertainty as part of life, but this was different. This was not an abstract mystery or a passing curiosity. This was personal, deeply human, and profoundly unsettling. Meanwhile, miles away from the glow of cameras and applause, Keanu Reeves had spent years living inside a world that felt smaller with every passing day. The silence that surrounded him had not been peaceful. It had been heavy, filled with the echo of thoughts he could not quiet and memories he could not outrun. To the public, his disappearance had been interpreted as another example of his quiet nature, his preference for privacy, his tendency to step away from the spotlight when it grew too loud. But the truth, as it often does, was far more complicated and far more painful. Beginning of his withdrawal had not been dramatic. It never is. It started with exhaustion, not the kind that sleep could fix, but the kind that settled into the bones. Years of carrying grief silently, years of being the calm presence for others while never allowing himself to fully fall apart had finally caught up with him. Keanu had always believed that strength meant endurance, that kindness meant not burdening others with your pain. Somewhere along the way, that belief had slowly isolated him. There were days when even simple conversations felt overwhelming, when responding to messages required energy he no longer had. He told himself he just needed time, a pause to recalibrate, a quiet space to breathe. So he stepped back, gently at first, declining invitations, postponing commitments, retreating into solitude. At the time, it felt like self-preservation. He did not realize it was the first step into something far deeper. The world around him continued to move forward. Films were released, new faces emerged, conversations shifted. And Keanu, once so present in the lives of others, became increasingly invisible, not because he wanted to disappear, but because he did not know how to ask for help without feeling like he was failing at the very values he held most sacred. The hospital admission came after a moment that changed everything. It was not a public breakdown, not an incident captured by anyone else's lens. It was a private collapse, quiet and terrifying, when his body and mind finally refused to carry the weight any longer. He found himself in a place where the usual coping mechanisms no longer worked, where silence turned from refuge into threat. The decision to seek help was not easy. It felt like surrender. But deep down, a part of him understood that survival sometimes requires admitting vulnerability. The hospital was not a place of punishment or judgment. It was a place of slow rebuilding. Days blended together as routines replaced chaos. Therapy sessions forced him to confront emotions he had spent years carefully locking away. There were moments of resistance, moments of doubt, moments when he questioned whether opening old wounds would heal them or tear him apart further. Yet there were also moments of clarity when he realized how deeply he had misunderstood strength. What hurt the most was the loneliness, not because people did not care, but because he believed they were better off without knowing. He convinced himself that reaching out would only complicate their lives, that disappearing was an act of kindness. In that belief, he stopped checking messages altogether. He stopped watching the world that once included him. Sandra Bullock's name appeared in his thoughts more often than he allowed himself to admit. She represented a time when connection felt effortless, when laughter and understanding flowed naturally. But he never allowed himself to reach for that memory fully. It felt safer to keep it distant, untouched. Years passed slowly, measured not by milestones but by small victories. Getting out of bed on days when the weight felt unbearable, speaking honestly in therapy sessions without deflecting with humor, allowing himself to feel sadness without immediately trying to justify it. Healing was not linear. There were setbacks that left him frustrated and moments of progress that felt fragile. But gradually something shifted. The silence inside him became less hostile. The fog began to thin. By the time he left the hospital system, Keanu was not the same man who had entered it. He was quieter, yes, but not empty. He carried a deeper awareness of himself and of the cost of suppressing pain. Still, he chose not to return to the life he once knew. Fame felt overwhelming and reconnecting felt daunting. The longer he stayed away, the harder it became to explain his absence. So he remained on the margins, living modestly, helping quietly where he could, finding purpose in small acts of kindness that did not require recognition. Back in her own world, Sandra began making careful inquiries, guided by respect and restraint. She did not push boundaries or demand answers. She simply asked questions, listened closely, and allowed professionals to do their work. Each piece of information confirmed what her instincts had already told her. Keanu had not vanished out of indifference. He had been surviving something few people ever saw. The realization stirred something powerful inside her. Compassion mixed with regret, not because she blamed herself, but because she wished the world had been kinder to someone who had given so much of himself to others. She reflected on how easily society celebrates strength while quietly overlooking the cost of maintaining it. Keanu's absence was no longer a mystery to solve. It was a story of resilience hidden behind silence. One evening, as Sandra sat alone reviewing what little information she had been allowed to access, she found herself thinking not about the past they shared, but about the future that might still be possible. Not a dramatic reunion, not a grand gesture, but something far simpler and far more meaningful. A conversation, an acknowledgement, a chance for him to know that his disappearance had not erased his place in the hearts of those who cared. She understood now that healing does not end when pain subsides. It continues when someone feels seen again. And for the first time in years, she felt certain that finding Keanu was not about reopening old chapters, but about offering a quiet reminder that he had never truly been forgotten. As the night deepened, Sandra made another decision, one that carried both hope and uncertainty. She would not rush. She would not force answers. But she would keep looking patiently, respectfully, guided by empathy rather than urgency. Because sometimes the most powerful form of kindness is simply refusing to let someone remain invisible. And somewhere, living a life shaped by humility and quiet endurance, Keanu Reeves felt an unfamiliar sensation stirring within him, as if the silence he had built around himself was beginning to crack, ever so slightly, making room for something he had not dared to expect. Connection, when two separate journeys quietly turned back toward each other. The search did not move quickly, and Sandra Bullock was grateful for that. Speed would have made it feel invasive, as though she were chasing a version of Keanu Reeves that no longer existed. What she wanted instead was understanding. She wanted to know where the years had taken him, how the silence had shaped him, and whether the man she once knew still recognized himself in the quiet life he now lived. Each step forward was careful, deliberate, guided by respect rather than urgency, because she understood that healing could be undone as easily as it could be nurtured. Sandra began by speaking with people who worked quietly behind the scenes, individuals whose roles rarely intersected with fame, but often intersected with truth. Social workers, counselors, and coordinators who had crossed paths with Keanu during transitional periods described him not as broken, but as deeply reflective, someone who listened more than he spoke and carried a kind of gentleness that made others feel safe even when he himself was struggling. These conversations confirmed something Sandra had always believed. Keanu's disappearance had never been an escape from responsibility. It had been an attempt to survive without hurting anyone else. What she learned next surprised her. After leaving structured care, Keanu had chosen a life that was intentionally simple. He lived modestly, avoided attention, and volunteered quietly with organizations that supported people facing emotional hardship. He never attached his name to these efforts, never sought recognition, and never spoke publicly about his own journey. To those he helped, he was simply a calm presence, someone who understood without asking too many questions, someone who sat with them in silence when words felt too heavy. For Sandra, this revelation was both comforting and heartbreaking. Comforting because it meant he had found purpose again, heartbreaking because it meant he had done so alone. At the same time, Keanu felt changes he could not explain. There were moments when the stillness he had grown accustomed to felt different, less isolating and more anticipatory, as though something long dormant was beginning to stir. He noticed it in small ways, a memory resurfacing without pain attached to it, a familiar laugh echoing in his mind without bringing regret. He did not know that Sandra was searching for him, but he felt the subtle shift that comes when isolation begins to loosen its grip. He spent many evenings walking through quiet neighborhoods, finding peace in movement and routine. These walks had become a form of meditation, a way to process thoughts without drowning in them. On one such evening, he passed a community center where a support group meeting was ending. People lingered outside, talking softly, sharing moments of connection before returning to their separate lives. Keanu paused briefly, watching them with a mixture of longing and gratitude. He had learned that healing did not mean erasing loneliness completely, but learning to coexist with it without letting it define you. What he had not learned yet was how to let someone back in. Sandra, meanwhile, wrestled with her own uncertainty. Knowing where Keanu was did not automatically mean knowing how to approach him. She understood that reappearing suddenly could reopen wounds he had worked so hard to heal. The last thing she wanted was to remind him of expectations, obligations, or a past he might not be ready to revisit. And yet, doing nothing felt equally wrong. Silence had already taken too much from both of them. She began writing letters she never intended to send, putting words to feelings she had never fully articulated. In those letters, she did not ask questions or seek explanations. She simply spoke about kindness, about the strange ways people drift apart without meaning to, and about the belief that connection, once formed, never truly disappears. Writing became a way to clarify her intentions. If she reached out, it would not be to demand answers, but to offer presence. Eventually, the opportunity presented itself in the most unexpected way. Through her charitable work, Sandra became aware of a small initiative focused on mental health advocacy that was seeking anonymous funding to expand its reach. The project resonated deeply with her values, and as she reviewed its background, she recognized subtle patterns in its philosophy, approaches she had seen described in Keanu's story. Though his name was not listed anywhere, she felt certain of his involvement. Instead of contacting him directly, she chose a different path. She offered support to the initiative itself, attaching a brief message meant not for the organization, but for the person behind it. The message was simple, intentionally so. It spoke of admiration for quiet strength, respect for unseen kindness, and gratitude for those who help others without asking to be known. When Keanu read the message weeks later, something inside him shifted. He did not recognize the handwriting or the name attached to the donation at first, but the words felt familiar in a way he could not explain. They echoed sentiments he had once shared with someone who understood him without trying to fix him. He read the message again, slower this time, and then once more, letting the weight of it settle. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to wonder if disappearing had truly protected the people he cared about, or if it had simply postponed a different kind of pain. Sandra waited without expectation. She did not check for responses or signs of acknowledgement. She trusted that if the moment was right, it would reveal itself naturally. And slowly, quietly, that moment began to take shape. Through intermediaries, subtle confirmations emerged that her message had been received, that it had mattered, and that someone on the other end was thinking deeply about its meaning. Neither of them rushed forward. Neither of them retreated. Instead, their separate journeys began to bend gently toward one another, guided not by nostalgia or obligation, but by mutual respect for the paths they had each walked alone. They were no longer the people they had been years ago, and that realization felt strangely reassuring. It meant that if they met again, it would not be to recreate the past, but to acknowledge the strength it had taken to survive it. Sometimes, reconnection does not arrive with dramatic reunions or emotional declarations. Sometimes it begins with a single moment of recognition, a quiet understanding that the silence between two people was never empty, only waiting for the right time to be filled with honesty. And as that understanding took root, both Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves felt something they had not felt in a very long time. Not certainty, not answers, but hope, steady and unassuming, reminding them that even after years apart, the human spirit has an extraordinary ability to find its way back to meaningful connection. The first words after years of silence. The moment of contact did not arrive with a ringing phone or a dramatic knock on a door. It arrived quietly, almost cautiously, as if the universe itself understood how fragile this reconnection was and chose not to disturb it with sudden noise. For Keanu Reeves, the decision to respond did not come easily. He spent days carrying the message in his thoughts, turning it over again and again, examining not just the words themselves, but what they stirred inside him. He had grown used to controlling distance, to managing connection from afar, where expectations could not reach him and disappointment could not find him. Responding meant stepping back into uncertainty, and uncertainty had once cost him dearly. Yet something about the message refused to let him dismiss it as coincidence. It was not flattering, not intrusive, not curious in the way people often were when they sensed mystery. It was gentle, respectful, and deeply understanding. It did not ask who he was or why he remained unseen. It simply acknowledged the quiet strength of choosing compassion when recognition is optional. That acknowledgement felt profoundly personal, and for the first time in years, Keanu allowed himself to consider that someone might still see him clearly, even without knowing where he stood. Sandra Bullock, on the other hand, did not know that her message had begun to loosen walls built over years of self-protection. She continued her work, honoring her promise to herself not to force outcomes. Still, she felt a subtle shift in her own emotional landscape. The act of reaching out, even indirectly, had lifted a weight she had carried without fully recognizing it. For the first time since discovering the logbook, she felt at peace with patience. She had done what felt right, and now she trusted the rest to unfold naturally. The reply, when it came, was understated. It arrived not as a direct message, but through a shared contact connected to the initiative. A simple acknowledgement of gratitude, carefully worded, intentionally anonymous, yet unmistakably thoughtful. Sandra recognized the tone immediately. It was unmistakably Keanu's voice, even without his name attached. Calm, reflective, sincere, and quietly emotional beneath its restraint. Reading it, she felt a warmth that surprised her, not because it reignited the past, but because it confirmed something she had hoped for but never assumed. He was still himself. For Keanu, writing that response felt like crossing an invisible threshold. He chose every word carefully, aware that even indirect communication carried weight. As he typed, memories surfaced uninvited, not as sharp reminders of loss, but as softened recollections of shared respect and understanding. He did not explain his absence or offer context for his years of silence. He simply expressed appreciation for being seen, for being understood without interrogation. In doing so, he acknowledged a part of himself he had long kept hidden, the part that still longed for connection without obligation. What followed was a delicate exchange, slow and intentional, carried through intermediaries who respected the sensitivity of the situation. Messages were brief but meaningful, each one building trust rather than urgency. They spoke about values rather than history, about purpose rather than regret. Sandra shared her belief that healing is most powerful when it is allowed to happen quietly, without pressure. Keanu shared his appreciation for spaces that honor silence as much as speech. Neither of them referenced the years that separated them directly, but the understanding hovered gently between every word. Eventually, the idea of speaking directly surfaced, not as a demand but as a possibility. The suggestion was made carefully, with full permission for it to be declined without explanation. Sandra made it clear that there was no expectation attached, no agenda to fulfill. Keanu sat with that suggestion longer than he expected to. The thought of hearing her voice again stirred a complex mix of emotions. There was anticipation, yes, but also vulnerability. Speaking meant being present in a way he had avoided for years. When he finally agreed, it was on his terms in a space that felt safe and familiar. The call was scheduled without ceremony, treated as something ordinary, even though both of them understood it was anything but. When the moment arrived, Keanu hesitated briefly before answering. The sound of Sandra's voice, calm and warm, filled the space between them, and for a few seconds neither of them spoke. Silence, once heavy and isolating, now felt respectful, allowing both of them to breathe. The conversation did not begin with explanations or apologies. It began with gratitude. Sandra thanked him for responding, for trusting the moment enough to step into it. Keanu thanked her for reaching out in a way that honored his boundaries. As they spoke, the years between them did not vanish, but they softened. There was no need to recount every detail of the past. What mattered was the present, the honesty of the exchange, and the mutual recognition that both of them had changed in ways that deserved respect. Keanu spoke carefully about learning the difference between solitude and isolation, about understanding that disappearing can sometimes feel like kindness, but connection is often the greater act of courage. Sandra listened without interrupting, without offering solutions, allowing him the space to speak freely. When she responded, she spoke not of loss, but of understanding, of how absence can leave questions that linger quietly, and how sometimes simply knowing someone is still out there matters more than knowing why they left. By the end of the call, neither of them felt the need to define what came next. There were no promises made, no plans established. And yet something profound had shifted. The silence that once separated them was no longer empty or unresolved. It had transformed into a shared understanding, a recognition that both had survived difficult journeys and emerged with deeper empathy for themselves and others. When the call ended, Keanu remained seated for a long time, absorbing the emotional weight of the conversation. He did not feel exposed or overwhelmed. Instead, he felt grounded, as if a piece of himself he had carefully guarded had been returned to him with care. Sandra, too, sat quietly after hanging up, reflecting on the quiet strength it takes to reconnect without demanding resolution. Sometimes, healing does not arrive through grand gestures or dramatic reunions. Sometimes it arrives through a single honest conversation, spoken softly, carried by mutual respect, and allowed to exist without pressure. For Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves, that conversation marked not the end of a journey, but the beginning of something far more meaningful. The understanding that even after years of silence, connection can be rebuilt when empathy leads the way. When presence said more than words ever could. Their first meeting after years apart was not arranged with ceremony or spectacle. There were no cameras, no public spaces, no attempt to frame the moment as anything other than what it was meant to be: private, respectful, and grounded in mutual understanding. Sandra Bullock chose a quiet place, one she knew would feel neutral and safe, a space untouched by the echoes of their shared past. It was important to her that this meeting did not carry the weight of expectations or the pressure of unresolved history. She wanted it to be about the present, about two people acknowledging each other exactly as they were now. Keanu Reeves arrived early, as he always had. He sat quietly, observing the subtle details of the room, grounding himself in the simplicity of the moment. Years of introspection had taught him the value of stillness, but this stillness felt different. It was not defensive. It was attentive. His thoughts were steady, yet beneath them was a quiet awareness of vulnerability, the kind that arises when you choose presence over distance. He was not afraid of seeing Sandra again, but he was deeply aware of how much had changed, not only in his life but within himself. When Sandra entered the room, the recognition between them was immediate and unspoken. There was no rush forward, no dramatic pause. They met each other's eyes with a shared understanding that neither needed to perform or explain. The years that separated them did not vanish, but they no longer felt like barriers. Instead, they felt like experiences that had shaped them into more grounded, more compassionate versions of themselves. They sat across from each other, allowing the moment to unfold naturally. Conversation came slowly at first, not because there was nothing to say, but because both of them understood the value of letting silence exist without tension. Sandra noticed the subtle changes in him, the calm that seemed less guarded and more intentional, the way he listened with full attention rather than waiting to respond. Keanu noticed the same in her, a steadiness that carried warmth rather than expectation, an openness that invited honesty without demanding it. When Keanu finally spoke about the years he had spent away, he did not frame them as something to justify or defend. He spoke of learning, of unlearning, of understanding how deeply silence can protect and harm at the same time. He spoke about realizing that carrying pain alone does not make it lighter, and that kindness toward oneself is often the hardest lesson to accept. Sandra listened with the same care she had always given him, not interrupting, not redirecting, simply being present. Her presence did not try to fix his story, it honored it. Sandra shared her own reflections, not as responses to his pain, but as parallel truths shaped by her own journey. She spoke about how absence leaves questions that linger quietly, how not knowing can sometimes be harder than knowing something painful. She spoke about learning that empathy does not require understanding every detail, only the willingness to remain open. As she spoke, Keanu felt something loosen within him, a quiet relief that came not from being forgiven, but from being understood without judgment. What surprised them both was how natural it felt to sit together after so long. There was no urgency to reclaim lost time, no attempt to define what this reconnection meant. Instead, there was a shared appreciation for the simplicity of the moment, a conversation unburdened by expectation, a presence that did not demand more than either of them could give. As time passed, they spoke about purpose and meaning rather than plans. Keanu shared how helping others quietly had restored a sense of direction he once thought he had lost. Sandra spoke about her belief that resilience is not about endurance alone, but about allowing yourself to be supported. They recognized how their paths, though separate, had been guided by similar values, values that had remained intact even when circumstances pulled them apart. When the meeting came to an end, neither of them felt the need to prolong it artificially. There was comfort in knowing that this was not a final moment, nor was it the beginning of something that required definition. It was simply a reconnection, grounded in respect and shared humanity. They parted with a quiet acknowledgement, an understanding that the door between them was no longer closed, even if it did not need to be wide open. Later that evening, both of them reflected on the meeting in their own ways. Sandra felt a deep sense of peace, not because everything had been resolved, but because something essential had been restored. Keanu felt gratitude, not just for the meeting itself, but for the reminder that connection does not have to be loud or consuming to be meaningful. Sometimes, simply being seen and accepted as you are is enough. This meeting did not erase the past, nor did it promise a future shaped by certainty. What it offered instead was something far more enduring, proof that compassion can bridge years of silence, that understanding can exist without explanation, and that the human spirit, when met with patience and empathy, has an extraordinary capacity to heal. And as both of them moved forward from that quiet encounter, they carried with them the knowledge that presence, when offered sincerely, can be the most powerful form of kindness of all. What remained after healing, and why it changed everything. In the weeks that followed their meeting, neither Sandra Bullock nor Keanu Reeves felt the need to define what had occurred between them. The absence of labels felt intentional, even necessary. There was a quiet understanding that some connections are strongest when they are allowed to exist without expectations, shaped not by what they are supposed to become, but by what they already are. Both of them had spent years learning difficult lessons about pressure, responsibility, and the cost of silence. Now they were learning something new together. That presence, when freely chosen, carries its own kind of freedom. Keanu found that something within him had shifted permanently. The years of isolation had taught him resilience, but the reconnection taught him something equally important, that resilience does not lose its strength when it is shared. He began to reflect on how often he had equated independence with virtue, believing that asking for support somehow diminished his ability to give to others. Through quiet moments of contemplation, he recognized that this belief had not come from truth, but from fear, fear of burdening others, fear of being misunderstood, fear of allowing vulnerability to exist alongside compassion. As he continued his work with those facing emotional hardship, Keanu noticed a subtle change in how he showed up. He listened the same way, spoke gently, and offered space without judgment, but there was a deeper openness now. He no longer positioned himself entirely on the outside. He allowed his own experiences, carefully and responsibly, to inform his empathy. The people he supported felt it too, even if they could not articulate it. There was a warmth in his presence that came from knowing he was no longer invisible to the world, nor hiding from it. Sandra, too, experienced a quiet transformation. For years, she had carried a sense of unfinished concern, something she had never fully named but always felt. Discovering Keanu's story, understanding the reality behind the silence, and choosing to approach it with patience rather than assumption allowed her to release that weight. She realized that caring deeply does not mean holding on to unanswered questions forever. Sometimes it means trusting that people find their way back when they are ready, and being prepared to meet them without resentment when they do. In her work and personal life, Sandra found herself speaking more openly about empathy, about the importance of checking in quietly, without expecting immediate responses or explanations. She became an even stronger advocate for mental and emotional well-being, emphasizing that resilience should never be measured by how much pain someone can endure alone, but by how willing they are to seek and accept connection. These messages resonated deeply with others, not because they were dramatic, but because they were honest. Their communication continued, but it remained intentionally unhurried. Some weeks passed without contact, others included brief conversations or shared reflections. There was no pressure to fill silence for the sake of reassurance. Both of them understood now that silence does not always signal distance. Sometimes it simply reflects trust that the connection remains even when words are unnecessary. One afternoon, long after the initial reconnection, Keanu found himself thinking about the hospital logbook, the place where his name had once been written without significance, just another entry among many. He realized that while that moment had marked a period of profound vulnerability, it had also unknowingly become the beginning of something meaningful. Sandra's decision to notice, to care, and to act with restraint rather than urgency had changed the course of his journey. Not because she rescued him, but because she reminded him that being seen matters. Sandra, reflecting on the same chain of events, recognized how easily she could have ignored the discovery, dismissing it as coincidence or respecting distance to the point of indifference. Instead, she chose empathy over comfort, patience over certainty, and compassion over assumption. That choice did not just reconnect her with someone she cared about. It reaffirmed her belief in the quiet power of kindness, the kind that does not announce itself or demand recognition. What remained between them was not a story defined by absence anymore, but one shaped by mutual growth. They did not return to who they once were, nor did they attempt to recreate a past that belonged to a different time. Instead, they moved forward as two individuals who had walked through darkness separately and emerged with a deeper appreciation for light, especially the kind that comes from simple human understanding. The true impact of their story extended beyond the two of them. In subtle ways, it touched the lives of those around them. People who witnessed their approach to reconnection saw an example of how relationships can be rebuilt without blame, how silence can be addressed without accusation, and how healing does not require dramatic closure to be real. It requires honesty, patience, and the courage to remain open. In the end, Keanu Reeves was not defined by the years he was gone, nor was Sandra Bullock defined by the years she wondered. They were defined by what they chose to do when their paths crossed again. They chose empathy over explanation, presence over pressure, and kindness over assumptions. Their story became a reminder that the human spirit does not always heal through noise or certainty. Often it heals through quiet moments, thoughtful choices, and the willingness to see one another fully, even after long periods of silence. And perhaps that is the most powerful lesson of all. That no matter how long someone has been gone, no matter how heavy the silence has been, it is never too late to choose understanding. Never too late to choose compassion, and never too late to remind someone, gently and without expectation, that they were never truly alone.